Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history in Natchez, Mississippi. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. The records state that on July 17, 1845, a man named Jonas disappeared from the Thornhill plantation located approximately 7 miles east of Natchez, Mississippi. What made this disappearance particularly notable was that it occurred the same night that nearly half of the cotton fields on the property were consumed by fire. The official accounts claim that Jonas, a man held in bondage on the plantation, was responsible for setting the blaze before vanishing into the thick woods that bordered the property to the north. But as with many historical events from this period, what remains in official documentation tells only a fraction of the story. The Thornhill plantation was owned by Augustus Thornhill, a man who had inherited the property from his father in 1835. The estate stretched across nearly 800 acres of fertile Mississippi soil, bordered on the west by a tributary of the Mississippi River and on the north by dense woodland that extended for miles. The plantation housed approximately 70 individuals who were enslaved, forced to work the land under brutal conditions. Jonas had been brought to the plantation in 1840, purchased at a slave market in New Orleans according to the plantation's meticulous ledgers. A notation in those same ledgers indicates that Jonas commanded an unusually high price, nearly twice what was typically paid for an enslaved field worker. The reason for this premium was noted simply as skilled blacksmith, but later events would suggest there was more to Jonas's value than just his ability to work metal. The ledger entry also included a physical description. Male, approximately 30 years of age, 6 feet in height, strong build, speaks well, bears scars on back from previous owner. Further investigation of the Thornhill family records conducted by historian Eleanor Benson in 1961 revealed additional details about Jonas's acquisition. In a personal letter to his banker in New Orleans dated February 1840, Augustus Thornhill wrote, "I have finally located the man my father mentioned. He was sold to a plantation in Louisiana after father's death, but has now been acquired by a trader in New Orleans. I am prepared to pay considerably above market value to secure his return to Thornhill. There are matters of significant family interest that only he can assist with." This letter suggests that Jonas had some previous connection to the Thornhill plantation, perhaps during the lifetime of Augustus's father. It also implies that Augustus sought him out specifically, rather than simply purchasing a skilled blacksmith from among the many enslaved workers available in the New Orleans market. By all accounts, the Thornhill plantation operated like many others in Adams County during that period. The main house stood at the center of the property, a 2-story structure with wide columns supporting a veranda that wrapped around the front and sides of the building. Behind the main house stood the overseer's quarters, a modest structure where Elijah Ward, the plantation's overseer, resided. Further back, beyond a small cluster of oak trees, were the cabins where those enslaved on the plantation were forced to live. The blacksmith shop, where Jonas spent much of his time, was located near the northern edge of the developed portion of the property, close to both the fields and the dense woods beyond. This positioning would later prove significant in understanding the events of July 17th. The shop itself was a sturdy structure with stone foundations and walls constructed of thick timbers. Inside was a forge, anvil, and various tools of the blacksmith's trade. It was here that Jonas repaired agricultural implements, fashioned hardware for the plantation buildings, and shod the horses used by Thornhill and his overseer. A visitor to the plantation in early 1845, a northern businessman named Howard Collins, left an account of meeting Jonas during his stay. In his travel journal, Collins wrote, "The blacksmith is a remarkable man. His skills with metal far exceed what one would expect to find on a plantation smithy. He fashions not just the crude implements of agriculture, but items of genuine artistry when permitted to do so. I observed a candlestick of his making in the main house that would not be out of place in the finest homes of Boston. The man himself is dignified in bearing despite his station, and unusually educated in speech. Mr. Thornhill seems to value him highly, though the same cannot be said of the overseer, who watches him with evident suspicion. According to records found in the Adams County Historical Society archives in 1964, the relationship between Augustus Thornhill and his overseer was strained in the months leading up to the incident. Correspondence between Thornhill and his brother in Virginia suggests that Thornhill had begun to question Ward's methods. In a letter dated April 3, 1845, Thornhill wrote, "Ward's severity continues to concern me. 2 men unable to work this month due to his heavy hand. Production suffers as a result, considering a change come autumn." This letter suggests that Thornhill, while still participating in the institution of slavery, had begun to view Ward's particular brutality as counterproductive to the plantation's economic interests. Another letter, dated May 12th, mentions that Ward seems increasingly preoccupied with matters beyond his duties. He has taken to wandering the property at odd hours and has been spending considerable time questioning the blacksmith about matters unrelated to his work. A third letter, discovered in the Virginia Historical Society archives in 1962, provides additional context for Thornhill's concerns about his overseer. Writing to his brother on June 2, 1845, Thornhill stated, "I fear Ward has somehow learned of Father's treasure. He makes oblique references to it in conversation and has been seen searching old records in my study when he thought himself unobserved. Most troubling is his new habit of taking Jonas from the smithy to question him privately. I have intervened where possible, but cannot always be present to prevent these interrogations. Jonas remains loyal, insisting he knows nothing of what Ward seeks, but I fear what methods the overseer might employ if his frustration grows." This letter provides the first direct reference in the historical record to the treasure that would later figure prominently in local legends about the plantation. It suggests that whatever valuables the elder Thornhill had hidden on the property during the War of 1812 were still undiscovered as of 1845, and that both Augustus Thornhill and Elijah Ward believed that Jonas possessed information about their location. What makes this case particularly disturbing is not just the event itself, but the silence that surrounds it. The disappearance of Jonas and the plantation fire were noted in the Natchez Courier with just 3 short paragraphs on July 20, 1845. The article mentioned the fire, estimated the damage at approximately $5,000, and stated that a Negro man named Jonas is believed to have set the blaze before fleeing the property. It concluded by noting that search parties continue to scour the surrounding area. But there were peculiarities about the case that were never addressed in public records. For one, the fire began not in one location, but in 3 separate points across the fields, suggesting either multiple individuals were involved or someone with intimate knowledge of how fire would spread across the plantation. Second, the fire started well after midnight, a time when movement on the plantation would have been heavily restricted and monitored. And third, Jonas was not the only person who could not be accounted for in the immediate aftermath of the fire. According to a handwritten note found in the sheriff's report, Elijah Ward was not present when the authorities first arrived at the plantation following reports of the fire. He appeared approximately 2 hours later, claiming to have been searching the nearby woods for Jonas. This absence, while noted in the initial report, was never investigated further by the authorities. The plantation's daily log, maintained by Elijah Ward, shows that Jonas worked as a field hand, but had also been trained as a blacksmith. This dual role gave him slightly more freedom of movement around the plantation than others. The log also contains a curious entry on July 15th, 2 days before the fire. It simply states, Jonas, insolent, corrected. The word corrected appears frequently in Ward's logs, a euphemism for physical punishment. An entry from July 16th, the day before the fire, is even more intriguing. It reads, "Blacksmith shop closed for repairs. Jonas assigned to North Field." This reassignment of Jonas from his primary role to field labor without any clear explanation of what repairs were needed in the blacksmith shop has led some historians to speculate that this may have been a punitive measure following whatever incident led to the correction noted the previous day. What happened in the weeks leading up to that night? According to testimony later given by Martha Wilson, a house servant at the Thornhill plantation, tensions had been growing throughout the summer. In a statement recorded in 1852 during a separate legal matter, she recalled, "That summer was hotter than most, and Mr. Ward was harder than usual. There was talk that Mr. Thornhill was going to sell the place. Everyone was on edge." She went on to describe how Ward had become increasingly fixated on Jonas. Mr. Ward would go to the smithy at odd hours. Sometimes you could hear them talking, their voices low. Other times it was quiet for a long while, and then you'd hear sounds that made you want to cover your ears. After these meetings, Jonas would move slow for days, like a man carrying a great weight. Martha Wilson's testimony also includes a description of an incident that occurred approximately 1 week before the fire. Mr. Thornhill and Mr. Ward had words loud enough that everyone in the big house could hear. It was about Jonas. Mr. Thornhill said Ward was to leave him be, that he was not to be questioned further without Mr. Thornhill present. Ward said something I couldn't make out, and Mr. Thornhill replied, "That is no concern of yours." After that, Mr. Ward's face was dark with anger for days. The summer of 1845 was indeed unusually warm in Mississippi. Weather records from Natchez indicate that July temperatures remained consistently above 90 degrees, with little rainfall to provide relief. The heat would have made the already grueling work in the fields even more unbearable. Historical records from neighboring plantations show that several experienced small rebellions or increased escape attempts during this period. But the story of Jonas and the Thornhill plantation fire contains elements that differentiate it from other accounts of resistance. According to local oral histories collected by Professor James Reynolds of Mississippi State University in 1963, there were rumors that Jonas possessed knowledge that made him particularly valuable to Augustus Thornhill, knowledge that went beyond his skills as a blacksmith. These oral accounts suggest that Jonas had information about the location of items of significant value that had been hidden somewhere on the property during the War of 1812, when the previous owner feared British troops might make their way up the Mississippi. While these accounts lack the verification of written records, they persist in the local folklore of Adams County to this day. One particularly detailed account came from Ezekiel Johnson, an elderly man whose grandparents had been enslaved on a neighboring plantation. Johnson recalled stories passed down about Jonas. The old folks said Jonas wasn't always at Thornhill. He'd been owned by the old master, the one who buried something valuable during the war. Story goes that Jonas had been just a young man then, strong enough to help with the digging, but too young to be considered a threat to the secret. The old master died soon after, and Jonas was sold off. Years later, Thornhill somehow found out about Jonas and bought him special, brought him back to the place. Johnson's account continued. They say old Mr. Thornhill, before he died, left a map or a letter for his son telling him that Jonas knew where the treasure was hid. But the letter didn't give the exact location, just that Jonas knew. So the son brought Jonas back, but Jonas wouldn't tell. Some say he couldn't remember exactly. Others say he was keeping the secret out of loyalty to the old master. Either way, the son couldn't find what his father had hidden, and it drove him half mad. If this account is accurate, it would explain both the high price paid for Jonas in 1840 and the unusual interest that both Thornhill and Ward took in him. It suggests that Jonas was acquired not just for his skills as a blacksmith, but for knowledge he possessed about the plantation and its secrets. Another oral history collected from Sarah Davis, whose mother had worked in the Thornhill house, adds an additional layer to the story. Mama said that sometimes Mr. Thornhill would have Jonas brought to the study late at night. They'd talk for hours, just the two of them. Mr. Thornhill would show Jonas old papers and maps. Once, Mama said, she saw them looking at a strange object, like a compass, but with additional markings. Mr. Thornhill seemed to be asking Jonas to explain how it worked. This account suggests that Thornhill may have been trying to piece together clues left by his father, using Jonas's knowledge to interpret them. It paints a different picture than that of a master simply demanding information from an enslaved worker. Instead, it suggests a more complex interaction driven by Thornhill's need for Jonas's cooperation. The night of the fire, according to the overseer's report to the local sheriff, was quiet until approximately 1 a.m, when Ward claimed he was awakened by the smell of smoke. Upon exiting his quarters, he discovered the western cotton field engulfed in flames. As he organized a response to the fire, additional blazes were discovered in the northern and eastern fields. By morning, nearly half of the plantation's cotton crop had been destroyed. It was during the chaos of fighting the fire that Jonas's absence was first noted. Ward's report states that Jonas was last seen at sunset the previous evening, when the enslaved workers returned from the fields. His absence was reported to the sheriff along with the notification of the fire, suggesting that Ward immediately connected the two events. However, a statement given by Samuel Turner, one of the enslaved field hands who helped fight the fire, contradicts Ward's timeline. In a deposition given years later, when Turner had gained his freedom and relocated to Ohio, he claimed, "Jonas wasn't missing when the fire started. He was there with the rest of us, trying to stop the flames. It was later, when things were at their worst and everyone was scattered, that I lost sight of him." Mr. Ward was giving orders, sending men to different parts of the field. He sent Jonas toward the northern edge, where the fire was spreading toward the woods. That was the last I saw of him. If Turner's account is accurate, it raises significant questions about Ward's version of events. It suggests that Jonas was present during the initial stages of the fire, rather than having set it, and fled beforehand. It also places Ward and Jonas in proximity during the confusion of the fire, at a location near where Jonas would have disappeared. What followed was an extensive search of the surrounding area. Records from the Adams County Sheriff's Department indicate that search parties were formed and continued to operate for nearly 2 weeks after the incident. These parties consisted of local plantation owners, their overseers, and professional slave catchers with trained dogs. They searched the woods to the north of the plantation, following the most likely escape route toward the Free States, as well as the swampy areas along the river where a fugitive might hide. But Jonas was never found. No trace, no sighting, no body. It was as if he had simply vanished into the night, leaving behind only the glow of the burning fields as evidence of his passage. A curious detail appears in the reports from the search parties. On July 19th, 2 days after the fire, one group reported finding signs of recent digging in a clearing approximately 3 miles north of the plantation. The report notes that the earth had been disturbed in an area about 3 feet square, suggesting that something had been buried, or perhaps more intriguingly, unearthed. This finding was noted but not thoroughly investigated, as the search parties were focused on capturing Jonas rather than understanding his movements. Another report, dated July 22nd, mentions finding a crude shelter of branches and leaves approximately 7 miles north of the plantation. Inside this shelter were the remains of a small fire and a metal implement, possibly a tool of some kind, which was collected as evidence. The description of the tool matches that of a blacksmith's hardie, a type of chisel used in metalworking, suggesting that Jonas may, indeed, have passed through the area. In the aftermath of the fire, Augustus Thornhill's financial situation deteriorated rapidly. Insurance records from the time indicate that while Thornhill had coverage for the structures on his property, the cotton crop itself was uninsured. The loss represented nearly half of his expected income for the year. Correspondence with creditors in New Orleans shows increasingly desperate attempts to extend deadlines for payment. A letter from Thornhill to his primary creditor, dated August 10, 1845, reveals his growing desperation. "The loss of the crop has placed me in an untenable position, but I assure you that I have resources not yet tapped. There are assets connected to this property that, once recovered, will more than satisfy my obligations. I request only time to secure these assets." This letter appears to reference the rumored hidden valuables on the plantation, suggesting that Thornhill still believed them to be accessible. However, subsequent correspondence indicates that his creditors were unimpressed by these vague assurances of hidden wealth. By September, they were demanding immediate payment or threatening foreclosure. A particularly revealing document from this period is a letter Thornhill wrote to a cousin in Richmond, dated September 3, 1845. In it, he states, "I am convinced that Ward knows more about the night of the fire than he has revealed. His behavior since has been most peculiar. He spends hours in the woods north of the property, ostensibly searching for Jonas, but returns with soil on his boots and an evasive manner when questioned about his activities. I've observed him from a distance on several occasions and noted that he appears to be searching for something, consulting what looks to be a hand-drawn map. I fear he may have extracted information from Jonas before his disappearance." This letter suggests that Thornhill had begun to suspect his overseer of foul play, potentially involving both Jonas's disappearance and the hidden valuables. It paints a picture of increasing paranoia and distrust on the plantation in the weeks following the fire. By December of 1845, Thornhill was forced to sell several of those he enslaved to cover his debts. Records from a New Orleans auction house confirm the sale of 13 individuals from the Thornhill plantation. The documentation is cold and clinical, listing ages, physical conditions, and sale prices, with no recognition of the human trauma such transactions represented. A receipt from this sale, preserved in the Thornhill family papers, includes a notation at the bottom in Augustus Thornhill's handwriting, a most distasteful necessity. If only Jonas had cooperated, all might have been spared this fate. The location dies with him, I fear, unless Ward has indeed found it. My suspicions grow daily. But what of Elijah Ward, the overseer? His movements after the fire present another curious element of this case. According to county records, Ward remained in Thornhill's employment until November 1845, at which point he disappears from the plantation's documentation. However, he does not appear in the employment records of any other plantation in the area. The next official record of Ward comes from a church register in Mobile, Alabama, dated 1847, nearly 2 years after the Thornhill fire. This gap in Ward's documented history has led to speculation among some historians. Professor Reynolds, in his notes from interviews conducted with descendants of families who lived near the Thornhill plantation, recorded a persistent rumor that Ward had been involved in some way with the fire. One account suggested that Ward had been engaged in embezzlement from the plantation and used the fire as a means to cover financial discrepancies that would soon be discovered. Another account, perhaps more disturbing, suggests that Ward had developed an unusual interest in Jonas. This interest, according to the oral history, was related to the rumored hidden valuables on the property. The implication was that Ward had been pressuring Jonas to reveal information about these items, using increasingly severe means. A third possibility emerged from a deed record discovered in the Jefferson County, Alabama archives in 1960. This document shows that in February 1846, a man named Elijah Ward purchased a modest property outside Birmingham, paying in gold coin. The description of Ward matches that of the Thornhill overseer, and the timing aligns with his disappearance from Mississippi. The source of Ward's sudden wealth was not documented, but the timing suggests a possible connection to the events at Thornhill Plantation. Further research conducted in the Birmingham area in 1965 uncovered additional information about Ward's life after leaving Thornhill. City directories list him as the proprietor of a general store from 1846 to 1853. Church records indicate he was an active member of a local Baptist congregation and contributed generously to building funds. A newspaper article from 1850 mentions him as a respected businessman who had recently been elected to the town council. What is particularly notable about these records is the apparent prosperity they suggest. Ward had transformed from a plantation overseer to a property owner, businessman, and civic leader in a remarkably short period. While not impossible through legitimate means, this rapid rise in fortune raises questions about whether Ward may indeed have located the hidden valuables that Jonas allegedly knew about. The most detailed account of the events comes from a journal discovered in 1959 during the renovation of an old home in Natchez. The journal belonged to Thomas Mercer, a physician who occasionally provided medical services to the Thornhill plantation. In an entry dated July 21, 1845, 4 days after the fire, Mercer wrote, "Called to Thornhill Place today. Augustus, in poor spirits, understandably so given recent events, while tending to an injured field hand, heard troubling accounts of the night of the fire. Several suggest Ward had taken Jonas to the old storehouse that evening. Screams were heard. Later, smoke was observed. Most curious is that Ward appeared with a bandaged hand the next day, claiming injury while fighting the blaze. The timing seems suspect. A subsequent entry, dated July 23rd, adds, "Return to Thornhills, the injured man's condition worsens. While there, examined Ward's hand at Augustus's insistence. The injury is unusual, a clean cut across the palm, more consistent with a blade than a burn. When questioned, Ward became agitated and departed abruptly. Augustus later confided that certain items of value connected to the estate have gone missing. He suspects Ward, but lacks proof." On August 2nd, Mercer wrote, "Augustus sent for me today, not as a physician but as a confidant. He is convinced Ward was involved in Jonas's disappearance and possibly the fire itself. He showed me a small wooden box discovered in Ward's quarters during a surreptitious search. The box contained a folded document that appears to be a crude map of the plantation with several locations marked by X's. Also in the box was a gold coin of Spanish origin, quite old. Augustus believes these items are connected to the treasure his father concealed during the war, and that Ward has been searching for it without his knowledge or consent. These entries suggest that there may have been more to the relationship between Ward and Jonas than appears in official records. They hint at a confrontation that occurred the night of the fire, one that may have triggered the subsequent events. The mention of missing items of value adds credence to the theory that the rumored hidden treasure was real and may have been discovered and taken. The old storehouse mentioned in Mercer's journal appears on a survey map of the plantation dated 1838. It was located at the edge of the property, near the northern woods. According to the map, it was a stone structure used primarily for storing tools and supplies. Its isolated location would have made it an ideal place for an interrogation away from witnesses. Archaeological work conducted on the former plantation site in 1964 located the foundations of this storehouse. Excavations revealed several interesting features, including a small chamber beneath the floor that appeared to have been accessed through a trapdoor. Within this chamber were found fragments of metal chains and what the archaeologists described as implements of restraint, suggesting the space may have been used to confine individuals. Carbon dating of charcoal found on the site indicated that a fire had occurred in or near the structure sometime in the mid-1840s, consistent with the timeline of the plantation fire. What happened in that storehouse? The historical record provides no clear answers. What we know is that by morning the fields were burning, Jonas was missing, and Ward had an injury he attributed to fighting the fire, but which at least one contemporary observer found suspicious. In the months following the incident, the atmosphere at the Thornhill plantation grew increasingly tense. Martha Wilson's testimony describes how Everyone walked soft and spoke quieter after that night. Mr. Thornhill took to drinking heavily. Mr. Ward watched everyone with suspicious eyes. No one mentioned Jonas's name, not ever, but everyone was thinking about him. She further recalled that Thornhill began spending long hours wandering the property, particularly at night. He'd be out there with a lantern, moving slow like he was looking for something in the grass. Sometimes he'd have a shovel with him. Come morning, you'd see fresh-turned earth here and there. He was searching for something, desperate-like. A similar account comes from Isaiah Brown, who worked in the stables at Thornhill. In a statement recorded in 1857 as part of a historical project documenting the experiences of formerly enslaved individuals, Brown said, "After the fire, Mr. Thornhill changed. He'd been stern before but not cruel. After, he was like a man possessed, would ride out at all hours, sometimes coming back covered in dirt like he'd been digging. He and Mr. Ward circled each other like dogs fixing to fight, neither trusting the other out of sight. This silence, this deliberate act of not speaking about what had occurred, is perhaps the most telling aspect of the events at the Thornhill plantation. It suggests a collective trauma, a shared understanding that certain truths were too dangerous to acknowledge openly. A letter from Augustus Thornhill to his brother dated October 3, 1845, reveals the extent of his mental decline following the fire. "I fear I have been deceived by those I trusted. The treasures father spoke of seem forever lost to me now." Ward claims ignorance, but his eyes betray him. "As for Jonas, I know not if he lives or if his blood stains this accursed soil. I drink to dull these thoughts, but they return with the night." Another letter, dated October 17th, is even more disturbing. "I am certain now that Ward has found what I have sought these many years. His manner has changed. He speaks of leaving my employ, of opportunities elsewhere. Yesterday I observed him burying something near the edge of the north woods. When confronted, he claimed to be merely disposing of broken tools from the smithy. But why then did he start so violently at my approach? And why had he not mentioned these tasks to me? I intend to investigate the site once he has retired for the evening." No subsequent letter describes what, if anything, Thornhill found during this nighttime investigation. However, plantation records show that Ward gave notice of his intention to leave Thornhill's employment just 3 days later on October 20th. This timing suggests that something significant occurred between Thornhill's planned investigation and Ward's decision to depart. By the spring of 1846, the Thornhill plantation was in financial ruin. Court records show that Augustus Thornhill's creditors initiated foreclosure proceedings in April of that year. By June, the property was sold at auction to satisfy debts. Thornhill himself relocated to his brother's home in Virginia, where he lived until his death in 1851. His death certificate lists the cause as liver failure, a common euphemism for deaths related to alcoholism during that period. An interesting footnote to Thornhill's final years comes from his brother's correspondence. In a letter to a family friend dated 1850, he wrote, "Augustus's mind continues to deteriorate. He speaks constantly of treasures lost and betrayals suffered. Most disturbing are his claims of hearing the sound of hammer on anvil in the night, though we have no smithy here. He insists it is Jonas still at work, calling him to account." A subsequent letter, dated just 2 weeks before Thornhill's death, adds, "Augustus wandered off yesterday, was found miles from home digging in the earth with his bare hands. When asked what he sought, he replied, 'What Jonas took from me.' He grows weaker daily, his mind increasingly untethered from reality. The physicians offer little hope. The fate of those enslaved at Thornhill after the foreclosure is partially documented in the sale records. Families were separated, individuals were dispersed to plantations across Mississippi, Louisiana, and Alabama. Their subsequent histories are largely lost to time, their experiences subsumed into the broader tragic narrative of American slavery. Martha Wilson, whose testimony provides much of what we know about the atmosphere at Thornhill following the fire, was purchased by a merchant from Natchez. According to city records, She later gained her freedom in 1857 when her new owner died and left instructions in his will for her manumission. She remained in Natchez until her death in 1873, supporting herself as a seamstress. Her grave in the African American Cemetery contains a simple marker with her name and the words, "She kept the stories." But what of Jonas? The official record maintains that he escaped after setting the fire, presumably heading north toward free territory. Yet no record exists of anyone matching his description appearing in any of the northern states or Canada, where many escaped enslaved people sought refuge. A different possibility emerged in 1962 when construction workers clearing land for a highway expansion approximately 15 miles north of the former Thornhill plantation uncovered human remains in a shallow grave. The location, in the woods that Jonas would have traversed had he fled north, raised questions about whether these might be his remains. However, forensic techniques of the time were unable to make a definitive identification, and the investigation was closed with no conclusions. One detail from this discovery was particularly notable. Among the remains was found a small metal object, heavily corroded but identifiable as a blacksmith's tool called a hardy, used for cutting hot metal when placed in the hardy hole of an anvil. The presence of this specialized tool suggests a connection to someone familiar with blacksmithing, lending some credence to the theory that the remains might indeed be those of Jonas. The medical examiner's report on these remains, filed with the Adams County Coroner's Office, notes several interesting details. The skeletal evidence suggested the individual was a male of African descent, approximately 40 years old, and of considerable height and musculature. These characteristics are consistent with the description of Jonas found in the Thornhill plantation records. More tellingly, the report states that fracture patterns on the skull are consistent with blunt force trauma, suggesting that the individual had suffered a severe blow to the head before death. Another theory regarding Jonas's fate emerged from records of a plantation in Louisiana approximately 60 miles southwest of Natchez. These records, discovered during a historical research project in 1965, show that in late 1845, a blacksmith named Joseph was purchased from a slave trader in New Orleans. The physical description of Joseph bears some similarity to what is known about Jonas, and the timing aligns with his disappearance. This has led some historians to speculate that Jonas may have been captured during his escape attempt and sold under a different name to hide his identity and prevent any connection to the Thornhill fire. An entry in the plantation's medical log from December 1845 notes that the new blacksmith Joseph bears evidence of recent severe treatment, including partially healed lacerations on his back and a poorly set fracture of the left forearm. These injuries could be consistent with someone who had been subjected to torture or interrogation before being sold. Perhaps the most intriguing development in the case came in 1968, when a researcher at the University of Mississippi discovered a series of letters in the archive of a church in Cincinnati, Ohio. The letters, dated from 1846 to 1848, were written by a man identifying himself only as J, to a minister known for his abolitionist activities. In these letters, J describes escaping from a plantation near Natchez after a night of fire and making his way north via the Underground Railroad. The letters contain details that align with what is known about Jonas and the Thornhill plantation. J mentions working as both a field hand and a blacksmith. He references an overseer with cruel methods who sought knowledge I possessed. Most significantly, he alludes to treasure hidden by a previous master, which he claims he used to finance his escape and establish himself in freedom. In one letter dated December 1846, J writes, "The old master buried his gold and silver during the war, fearing it would be taken. Before he died, he told me where to find it, making me swear never to reveal the location to another soul. When the new master brought me back to that place, I knew it was not by chance. He and his overseer sought what I knew, but I kept my oath. On the night I left, I dug up what had been hidden and took only what I needed for my journey to freedom. The rest I left where no man will ever find it." A subsequent letter, dated March 1847, provides additional details. "The overseer discovered me that night as I was making final preparations to depart. He had followed me to the hiding place and observed as I retrieved a portion of the treasure. We struggled, and I feared for my life, for he was armed with a pistol. In the struggle, his hand was cut by my smith's knife. I managed to overcome him temporarily and fled, but knew he would soon raise the alarm. As I ran toward the northern woods, I saw an opportunity to create a diversion. The fields were dry from weeks without rain, and with my tinderbox, I was able to start a fire that spread quickly. I did not stay to watch it grow, but continued north with all haste." If these letters were indeed written by Jonas, they suggest that he not only escaped, but managed to reach free territory and establish a new life. They also lend credence to the rumors about hidden valuables on the Thornhill property and imply that Jonas may have located these items before his departure. The account of the struggle with Ward aligns with the physician's observation of Ward's hand injury, suggesting that this may indeed be an authentic first-hand account of the events of July 17, 1845. However, the provenance of these letters cannot be verified with absolute certainty. They disappeared from the archive in 1969 during a reorganization of the collection, and their current whereabouts are unknown. Their content is known only through the notes made by the researcher who initially discovered them. A tantalizing connection to these letters emerged in 1966, when records from a small black-owned business in Cincinnati were discovered during a historical preservation project. These records show that in 1849, a man named James Smith established a blacksmith shop in an area of the city known to have been home to many formerly enslaved people. Smith operated this business successfully until his death in 1878. While there is no direct evidence connecting this James Smith to Jonas from the Thornhill plantation, the timing, location, and profession align with the narrative suggested by the J letters. City directories from Cincinnati list James Smith as a respected artisan known for his exceptional metalwork. A newspaper article from 1860 describes him as a formerly enslaved man who has built a life of dignity and prosperity through his considerable skills. The article mentions that Smith was known for his philanthropic activities, particularly his support of the Underground Railroad and assistance to those newly arrived from bondage in the South. Perhaps most intriguingly, probate records following Smith's death in 1878 indicate that he possessed considerable wealth for a man of his background and era. His estate included not only his blacksmith shop and residence, but also several investment properties in the city and a substantial amount in gold coins, some of which were noted to be Spanish doubloons of considerable age. This detail aligns with the description of the treasures allegedly hidden at Thornhill Plantation. The story of Jonas and the Thornhill Plantation fire remains in many ways unresolved. The official narrative, that of an enslaved man who burned his master's property in an act of rebellion before escaping, may contain elements of truth, but fails to account for the complexities suggested by the broader historical record. What seems clear is that the events of July 17, 1845, emerged from a context of brutality, resistance, and hidden knowledge. The fire that consumed the Thornhill cotton fields was not merely a destructive act, but a moment of transformation for Jonas, for the plantation, and for all those connected to it. A detailed analysis of the James Smith connection was conducted by historian Marcus Jenkins in 1967. He discovered that Smith had purchased his freedom and blacksmith shop using gold coins of Spanish origin, similar to those described in the Thornhill family correspondence. Jenkins also found evidence that Smith maintained connections with abolitionists active in the Underground Railroad, particularly those operating along routes from Mississippi and Louisiana to the Free States. Perhaps most compelling was Jenkins's discovery of a small leather-bound journal among Smith's possessions, preserved by his descendants. While much of the journal focused on business matters and daily activities, several entries appeared to reference a past that aligned with what we know of Jonas. One such entry, dated August 17, 1850, reads, "5 years since the night of fire. Freedom tastes sweeter with each passing day, but the memory of that night still visits my dreams." The struggle, the flames, the long journey north, these things are branded upon my mind as surely as the iron I now shape to my own will. Another entry, dated December 3, 1853, states, "Today a man from Natchez visited the shop seeking repairs to his wagon. I feared recognition, but his eyes showed no sign of awareness. Still, the encounter has unsettled me. The past is never truly behind us, merely waiting around the next corner." These journal entries, while not definitively connecting James Smith to Jonas of Thornhill Plantation, suggest strongly that Smith had fled from somewhere in the Natchez area following a significant fire. The timing and circumstances align with what we know of Jonas's disappearance. The landscape itself has transformed in the intervening years. The Thornhill Plantation no longer exists as a distinct property. The land has been divided, developed, and repurposed. Modern highways cut through what were once cotton fields. Suburban homes stand where slave cabins once stood. The physical reminders of what transpired there have been erased by time and progress. An archaeological survey conducted in 1970 attempted to map the original Thornhill Plantation based on period maps and physical evidence remaining on the site. The survey team located the foundations of the main house, the overseer's quarters, and several of the outbuildings, including what appeared to be the blacksmith shop where Jonas had worked. The report notes that evidence of extensive burning was found across much of the site, particularly in the areas corresponding to the former fields. Most intriguing was the discovery of a small underground chamber beneath what had been the blacksmith shop. This chamber, approximately 6 feet square and 4 feet deep, had been carefully constructed with brick walls and a stone floor. Inside were found several metal objects, including blacksmith's tools and what appeared to be a small lockbox, though the box itself had deteriorated to the point that only its metal fittings remained. The archaeological report suggests that this chamber may have been used to conceal valuables, potentially including some portion of the rumored Thornhill treasure. Yet, in archives, in oral histories, in the collective memory of the community, echoes of that night remain. The story of Jonas, of the fire that illuminated the Mississippi night, of the overseer with his bandaged hand, of the master who lost everything, these elements persist, fragments of a truth that was never fully told. One particularly persistent local legend claims that a portion of the treasure Jonas allegedly took was never used. According to this story, he buried it somewhere along his escape route, intending to return for it once safely established in the north. Various locations have been suggested as the hiding place, from a clearing in the woods north of the plantation to a cave system along the Mississippi River. While these stories have inspired numerous amateur treasure hunters over the years, no discoveries have been reported. However, in 1964, during the construction of a bridge approximately 5 miles north of the former Thornhill Plantation, workers uncovered a small metal container buried several feet below the surface. Inside were found 23 gold coins of Spanish and Portuguese origin, dating from the late 18th and early 19th centuries. The location of this find corresponds roughly with the route Jonas would likely have taken if fleeing north, lending some credence to the legend of buried treasure along his escape route. A report filed by the construction foreman notes that the container also held a small metal object identified as a blacksmith's punch, a tool used for creating holes in hot metal. The inclusion of this specialized tool suggests a connection to someone with knowledge of blacksmithing, potentially supporting the theory that the cache was indeed left by Jonas during his flight from Thornhill. In 1965, a descendant of one of the families that had been enslaved at the Thornhill Plantation was interviewed by Professor Reynolds. When asked about the stories passed down about the plantation fire, the elderly woman replied, "My grandmother told me that the fire wasn't just in the fields that night. She said it was a fire that had been building for years in people's hearts. and once it started burning, it couldn't be put out. The woman, identified in Reynolds's notes as Elizabeth Carter, age 87, continued, "Grandmother said Jonas was a quiet man, kept to himself mostly, but he had knowledge that others didn't, and that made him both valuable and dangerous. She said that on the night of the fire, many saw their chance and took it." The story that came down was that Jonas wasn't the only one who disappeared that night. 2 others went missing as well, though their names weren't recorded like his was. They used the confusion of the fire to make their way north. This account suggests that the fire may have served as cover for multiple escapes, not just that of Jonas. It implies a level of coordination, or at least opportunism, among those enslaved at Thornhill that goes beyond the official narrative of a single man's desperate flight. Perhaps that is the most accurate assessment of what occurred at the Thornhill plantation. Not merely a physical fire that consumed cotton plants, but a manifestation of the smoldering resistance that existed wherever human beings were held in bondage. The flames that rose from the Thornhill fields on that July night were visible for miles, according to contemporary accounts. They served as both destruction and illumination, revealing, however briefly, truths that many preferred to keep hidden. An account from a neighboring plantation owner, recorded in a letter to a business associate in New Orleans, described the scene. The night sky above Thornhill was as day, the flames reaching higher than the tallest trees. From my veranda I could see figures moving against the light, small as ants, trying in vain to control the blaze. It was a fearsome sight, one that I confess caused me to double the watch on my own property that night and for many nights thereafter. The letter continues with an observation that suggests the fire at Thornhill was viewed as more than just an isolated incident. There has been unrest throughout the county since, whispers of rebellion, of secret meetings. I have increased discipline on my own property as a precaution. What happened at Thornhill must not be allowed to spread like the flames that consumed Augustus's fields. This perspective from a contemporary observer indicates that the Thornhill fire was perceived as potentially part of a broader pattern of resistance, not merely an act of individual defiance. It suggests that the events of July 17, 1845, may have inspired others and contributed to a climate of tension and fear among plantation owners in the region. And what of the silence that followed? The reluctance to speak Jonas's name, the gaps in the historical record, the lost letters, the unidentified remains. These absences tell their own story. They speak to the power of certain narratives to disturb, to unsettle, to challenge established orders. A local newspaper editor, writing an editorial about a separate matter in 1847, made an oblique reference to the Thornhill fire. When certain events occur that challenge the natural order of our society, there is a tendency among gentlemen to consign such occurrences to a collective silence. This silence, while perhaps well-intentioned, serves only to feed speculation and unease. Better to address matters directly, however uncomfortable, than to allow imagination to run unchecked. This editorial suggests a broader societal reluctance to directly confront events like the Thornhill fire and Jonas's disappearance. It implies a recognition that such incidents threatened the narratives that supported the institution of slavery, and that silence was one means of attempting to contain that threat. In the archives of Adams County, the file containing the official reports on the Thornhill plantation fire is thin, just a few pages of faded text that provide the basic outline of events. But between those lines, in the spaces where information should be but is not, lies a different kind of record, one of resistance, of agency reclaimed, of secrets kept and revealed. A curious footnote to the story emerged in 1957 when an amateur historian researching the Thornhill case claimed to have discovered an unmarked grave on what was once the plantation property. According to his account, the grave was located near the site of the old blacksmith shop and contained the remains of an unidentified individual along with several metal items consistent with blacksmithing tools. However, no formal archaeological investigation was ever conducted, and the site was later developed, making verification impossible. The historian Robert Gaines published his findings in a small local journal, writing, "The grave was shallow, suggesting hasty burial. The remains had been interred with care, however, the body positioned with dignity and the tools placed deliberately alongside it. This was not a careless disposal of evidence, but a respectful laying to rest. The question remains, who performed this burial, and who was its subject?" Gaines speculated that the grave might contain the remains not of Jonas, but of someone else connected to the events of July 17, 1845. Perhaps another enslaved person who died during or immediately after the fire. The presence of blacksmithing tools, he suggested, might indicate a connection to Jonas, possibly an apprentice or assistant in the smithy. Today, the woods north of where the Thornhill plantation once stood remain dense and largely undeveloped. Local residents occasionally report unusual sounds emanating from these woods at night. Whispers, they say, or sometimes what sounds like the rhythmic striking of metal on metal, like a blacksmith at work. Scientists attribute these sounds to natural phenomena, wind through the trees, wildlife, the contraction of metal from old structures as temperatures drop at night. One local resident, interviewed for a newspaper article in 1962, described his experience. "I was hunting in those woods last fall, just after sunset. The light was fading, and I was heading back to my truck when I heard it, clear as day, the sound of a hammer on anvil. Rang out 3 times, then silence. I know what smithing sounds like. My grandfather was a blacksmith, and I spent hours as a boy watching him work. This was that same sound, no question about it. But there's no forge in those woods, hasn't been for 100 years or more." Similar accounts have been reported periodically over the decades, always describing the same distinctive sound of metal striking metal, always coming from the vicinity of what was once the northern edge of the Thornhill plantation. While easily dismissed as imagination or natural sounds misinterpreted, the consistency of these reports across generations is notable. But for those familiar with the story of Jonas and the Thornhill plantation fire, these sounds carry different connotations. They serve as reminders that the past is never truly silent, that stories once thought concluded may continue in ways we cannot fully comprehend. A local guide who leads historical tours of the area explained it this way in an interview conducted in 1966. "History isn't just what's written down in books. It's what lives in the land, in the air, in the memories passed down. The story of Jonas and the Thornhill fire, it's not just about what happened on one night in 1845. It's about all that led to that night, and all that followed from it. It's about what was spoken and what was left unsaid. And in those woods, especially when the night is still and the moon is dark, you can sometimes hear those unspoken truths finding their voice." The guide, William Jackson, whose own ancestors had been enslaved in Adams County, added, "People ask me if I believe the woods are haunted. I tell them it's not about ghosts, it's about memory. This land remembers what happened here, even when people try to forget. The sounds people hear, they're echoes of resistance, of someone who refused to remain bound, who took his fate into his own hands. That's not a ghost story. That's history speaking, if you know how to listen." In the end, what we know with certainty about Jonas and the events of July 17, 1845, is limited. The historical record provides a framework, but within that framework exist gaps, contradictions, and possibilities that remain unexplored. The fire occurred. Jonas disappeared. Lives were irrevocably changed. Beyond these basic facts lies a territory of speculation, of interpretation, of stories told and retold across generations. Perhaps that is fitting. The story of Jonas is, after all, a story of silence and of voice, of those who sought to impose silence, and those who, despite overwhelming odds, found ways to make themselves heard. It is a story of fire, both the literal flames that consumed the cotton fields and the metaphorical fire of resistance that could not be extinguished. A historian writing about the case in 1963 observed, "The Thornhill Plantation fire represents a moment when the carefully constructed narrative of control and order that underpinned the institution of slavery was disrupted. In that disruption, we glimpse alternative possibilities, alternative histories that might have been." Jonas, whether he perished that night or found his way to freedom, momentarily inverted the power structure that defined his existence. In so doing, he wrote himself into a history that might otherwise have rendered him invisible. This observation captures the dual nature of Jonas's act, both a response to immediate circumstances and a challenge to the broader system that created those circumstances. It suggests that, regardless of his ultimate fate, Jonas's actions on the night of July 17, 1845, represented a form of authorship, a claiming of agency in a context designed to deny it. In 1968, a collection of oral histories was compiled by researchers from Tougaloo College, focusing on stories passed down through generations of African American families in the Natchez area. Several of these narratives included references to the Thornhill Fire and to Jonas. One particularly detailed account came from Harold Wilson, then 78 years old, whose great-grandmother had been enslaved on a plantation near Thornhill. Wilson recalled, "Great-grandmother spoke of Jonas as a hero. She said he was a man who carried knowledge in his head that white folks wanted but couldn't take. She said he used that knowledge to buy his freedom, not with money paid to a master, but with courage and fire. The story that came down was that he made it north and lived as a free man, working metal like he'd done in bondage, but now for himself and his community. She said some nights you could hear his hammer still, calling others to follow the path he'd blazed." This narrative, preserved through generations of oral tradition, presents Jonas not as a victim or a mere rebel, but as a strategist who used the knowledge he possessed, both of metalworking and of the hidden treasure, to engineer his own liberation. It frames his actions not as desperate or impulsive, but as calculated and effective. As we conclude this exploration of one of the most disturbing cases in the history of Natchez, Mississippi, we are left with questions that may never be fully answered. Did Jonas escape to freedom in the North? Did he perish in the woods that night? What knowledge did he possess that made him both valuable and dangerous? What truly happened in that old stone storehouse on the edge of the plantation? The answers, if they exist at all, are hidden in archives yet to be discovered, in stories yet to be told, in silences yet to be broken. The case of Jonas and the Thornhill Plantation fire remains open, a historical mystery that continues to resonate across time. In 1966, a researcher named Catherine Brooks proposed a new theory about the events at Thornhill Plantation. Based on her examination of weather records and agricultural reports from 1845, she suggested that the fire may have had natural origins, potentially sparked by lightning during a dry thunderstorm that passed through the area on the night of July 17th. Brooks argued that Jonas may have used the naturally occurring fire as cover for his escape, rather than setting it himself. While this theory has been debated among historians, it introduces an interesting possibility that nature itself may have intervened at a crucial moment, providing an opportunity that Jonas seized. It suggests a convergence of natural events and human agency that further complicates the already complex narrative of that night. Some local historians in Adams County maintain that on particularly hot summer nights, when the air is still and heavy with humidity, the scent of smoke can sometimes be detected in the area where the Thornhill Plantation once stood, a phantom reminder of a night when fire changed everything. Whether this is true or merely another layer of legend added to an already complex narrative is, like so much in this case, a matter of perspective and belief. A soil analysis conducted in the area in 1969 did reveal unusually high levels of ash and carbon in certain locations, consistent with the aftermath of a major fire. The researchers noted that these chemical signatures can persist in soil for decades or even centuries, providing physical evidence of events long past. In this sense, the fire that consumed the Thornhill fields that July night continues to leave its mark on the land itself, a tangible connection to a history that might otherwise exist only in documents and memories. What is beyond dispute is that on July 17, 1845, something happened at the Thornhill plantation that defied the expected order of things, something that left its mark not just on the physical landscape, but on the historical record and the collective memory of a community. It is a reminder that history is not always what is written in official documents, but also what persists in stories passed down, in unexplained phenomena, in questions that remain unanswered. And perhaps, in the end, that is the true legacy of Jonas. Not just the fire that illuminated the Mississippi night, but the enduring mystery that continues to provoke thought, discussion, and reflection more than a century later. In a world that seeks certainty and closure, his story reminds us that some narratives resist such neat conclusions, remaining forever open-ended, forever unresolved. A final note about the case came in 1967, when a historian researching Underground Railroad routes discovered a worn wooden sign in the collection of an abolitionist society in Pennsylvania. The sign, which had apparently hung in a safe house along the route to Canada, bore a simple image burned into the wood, an anvil with a flame rising from it. According to the Society's records, this symbol was used to indicate to those escaping slavery that a blacksmith sympathetic to their cause was nearby and could offer assistance. The sign was believed to date from the late 1840s, around the time that Jonas, if he had indeed escaped successfully, would have been making his way north. Whether this sign has any direct connection to Jonas of Thornhill Plantation cannot be determined with certainty. But like so many elements of this story, it suggests possibilities, connections, and continuities that extend far beyond the events of a single night. It reminds us that the fire that began in the Thornhill fields may have sparked other fires of resistance and solidarity along the path to freedom. The fields of the Thornhill plantation have long since been reclaimed by nature or repurposed by human hands. The cotton no longer grows there. The sounds of forced labor no longer echo across the land. But the story remains, carried forward through time, a testament to the complexity of our shared past and the power of a single night to reverberate across generations.